So, in my last video, I built a tiny leopard tank and created a diorama on my hand. Since that was a bit impractical, I decided to build another diorama. Hi, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Falk, and in today's video I'll be building a simple and easy forest diorama for my leopard tank. Alright, like all my diorama projects, this one starts out with a block of XPS Foam. I haven't done a circular base before, so I also designed myself a cutting template for my hot wire cutter, so I can cut a nice and round shape. One of the biggest problems I've had in the past when building a diorama like this was wrapping the base in wooden veneer. Often the wooden veneer cracked on me, or it was quite difficult to attach it to the XPS foam. So for this project I decided to try something new. I took a sheet of polystyrene and some contact spray adhesive, and I sprayed the XPS foam with that spray adhesive and wrapped it with the polystyrene sheet. This way I created a nice and even surface around the XPS foam. It also has the positive benefit of having a surface that is immune to harsher glues, so I can stick down the wood veneer with a quite strong glue without having the risk of damaging the foam underneath. After the base was wrapped with the polystyrene, I used my tiny table saw to cut the seam into the polystyrene where it overlapped and created myself a nice seam line. And after that I was able to cut away the excess using some scissors and my hobby knife. I also decided to try and pre-bend the wooden veneer. The radius of the circular base I had in mind is quite small, so I decided to soak the wood veneer for about 30 minutes in boiling water, and then I put it into the offcut of the XPS base I created earlier and used it as kind of a jig to bend the wood veneer into the rough shape. As you can see, even after 30 minutes of cooking the wood, it was still quite sturdy when I tried to put it into my jig. But it wasn't that big of a problem. It didn't break or anything, so I was quite happy with that. And after everything was in the right place, I used some MDF fiberboard and 2 large clamps to clamp the jig together so the wood veneer wasn't able to pry it open. And when I came back the next morning, I was able to take the wood veneer out of the jig, and as you can see, I had an almost perfect fitting piece of wooden veneer. With the wood veneer bent into this shape, it was a lot easier to glue it to the foam base. I did need way less force than on my last projects, and I didn't have any issues of the wooden veneer breaking. And I also tried out a new glue. This is a contact adhesive made by Patix that is sold here in Germany, and you have to apply it to both surfaces. So I took my foam roller, applied it to the XPS base and also to the wooden veneer. And after about 15 minutes of the glue drying, I was able to just roll the XPS base over the wood veneer, and it got stuck into place quite tight. There's also one important rule I like to follow. The toughness of a glue is determined by its smell, and this one smells pretty bad, so I guess it's quite strong. And after I glued it to the base, I again used my tiny table saw to create the seam line and also used my scissors again to cut off the excess. It seems also to be quite a nice idea to use a tiny table saw to cut the seam line. It creates a 0.5 mm gap between both ends of the wood veneer that can easily be filled with wood putty. Also, I didn't have any splintering. When I used my X-Acto knife in the past, I always had a few issues with splinters on the ends of the wood veneer, but this time, no splinters at all. And then it came to the best part, applying the VMS Smart Mat. And I did this in 2 layers this time. Before I started the project, I decided that I wanted to create a compact dirt road in the foreground, and that was easier achieved with 2 layers of VMS Smart Mat. The first layer of VMS Smart Mat was there to ensure that the second layer would stick down a lot better, and it would be easier to smooth it out without ripping it off from the foam. That's maybe the biggest downside of the Smart Mat. Sometimes you have quite a hard time to stick it down to the foam if you didn't apply any texture underneath. And after that I used my go-to technique of sprinkling some Crowd Cover Scenics Common Earth over the Smart Mat, and then I used the tank itself and some track pieces I had left over from the kit to create some track impressions. For this project I used a newly opened can of VMS Smart Mud. If you open a new can, it takes quite a lot of time to solidify until you can create track impressions without being too soft, so I had to wait around an hour before I started to create the track impressions. And as you can see, I also applied another layer of Smart Mud in the area where the forest will be in the end, so I get a more uneven ground in that area. And again I sprinkled some Crowd Cover Scenics Common Earth over the fresh Smart Mud to create a more uneven look of the ground. And after the basic groundwork was done, I was able to cut off the excess wood veneer using my hobby knife. I also sanded down the excess veneer and the excess styrene sheet on the bottom of the base, but I did this outside so I didn't ruin my living room, and because of that, sorry, but there's no footage of that. But it's quite a boring task anyway. And after the wood veneer was brought into shape, it was time to add the birch trees to the scene to see how everything looks and fits together. In a later part of this video I will also talk about my general idea behind this diorama. But first let me show you how I created those trees. And I'm not gonna lie, those trees are easily the favorite part of this diorama for me. It was incredibly fun to create those trees and I really liked the outcome. Since 1/72 scale is quite small, it wasn't necessary to collect any twigs from the outside for the use as a trunk, and those trees are entirely made out of seafoam. I picked through my seafoam collection and took out a few pieces that were quite straight and a bit thicker than the rest, so I can use them as the main trunk for those trees. I then started out by removing all those smaller branches so I can start from zero and I don't have to work around any existing branches that were already on the piece of seafoam. I then again went through my seafoam collection a second time and collected all the nice branches from it. I then divided them into different sizes, so it's a bit easier to create a realistic looking tree shape. And before I started to glue anything together, I went outside and took a look at some birch trees I have around my area. Since it's winter, they have no leaves on them and that makes it quite easy to see the exact shape of the tree itself, and that really helped me a lot. And after I was calm and relaxed from my trip to the forest to look at real birch trees, it was time to glue all these small branches to the main trunk. For this job I just used normal super glue and also some super glue accelerator, so the branches would stick into place a bit easier. Also, if I needed, I reinforced the joint between the branch and the tree trunk with a bit more super glue and then again hit it with super glue activator. And since seafoam is quite smooth, I used some AK Interactive corrosion texture paint to create some nice bark texture on the tree trunk itself. I tried to carefully stick my brush between the different branches on the tree, but in some areas I wasn't able to add any texture. But since there will be a lot of leaves on those trees, those won't be that visible in the end. And then it was time for the basic paint job. I used Mr. Mahogany Surfacer as a primer. I then sprayed Tamiya Deck Tan over all the tree and then hit it with some Tamiya Flat White from above to create this nice white look that birch trees almost always have. And of course I also added the most important feature on any birch tree, the dark spots where the white bark peels off and reveals the underlying dark bark. And again, I used my reference pictures I was able to take in the forest, so I can create a convincing look on those birch trees. And it seems like that I was quite successful with that. At one point my girlfriend entered the room and was like, "Oh, you're creating birch trees, right?" So I guess I was on the right track then. And like in every project, I also used a few enamel paints, mainly a moss one, to create a few moss stains all over the trees, and my dark umber panel liner to create some fake shadows all over the tree. And of course I used some enamel thinner to blend those paints together. At a later spot I also decided to add a few white highlights to the tree trunk, since it became a bit dark using the dark umber wash. And then it was time to work on the foliage. I used my Crowd Cover Scenics fast drying basing glue and a toothpick to apply small amounts of glue in the areas where the leaves would sit. This glue is quite sticky from the beginning, so it's easy to sprinkle the leaves over, and I worked in smaller sections, working my way around the trees. When I was done with applying the glue in one area, I used AK Interactive 1:72 scale birch leaves in the autumn color and sprinkled them over the tree in small amounts. I mostly applied those leaves from the top side, but I also made sure to sprinkle a few from the bottom, so the tree would look nice and dense. Also, make sure to shake off the excess in between sprinkles, so you only get leaves in the areas where you want them. And after all those leaves were glued into place, it was time for another fun task. Painting all of them, or most of them, since the base color of those leaves was quite okay for me. I used my artist grade oil paints for this task. Those contain a lot more pigment than the ones sold for modeling purposes, so they are a lot brighter. I also used a bit of thinner to dilute them into a thick wash that then was applied all over the tree. I started out with my darkest orange and applied it all over a tree until I was able to spot a difference in color between the base color of those leaves and my oil paint. Then I took a lighter orange and I finished everything off using a quite bright cadmium yellow. So after we now spent some time talking about trees, let's get back to the groundwork. I marked the position of the tank in place, so I won't add any scatter material in the track marks where the track has to sit later. I then started to apply some glue to the ground, so I can use my static grass applicator to create a few patches of grass all over the base. And again, 1:72 scale is quite small, so I mostly stuck to my 2mm static grass, so the grass won't appear too long next to the tank. But I also added a bit of 4mm static grass in a few selected areas, to create some variation. And of course, this was a job for my Woodland Scenic Static King. But this time I only used one side of the two-sided compartment, so I can apply the 4mm grass in a more controlled manner. And like every time when I do static grass, after I applied the first layer, I took out my small vacuum cleaner and removed all the excess. And after the excess was removed, I applied a bit more glue to add the 4mm static grass. Normally you can spare yourself that work, but I had quite some time in between applying the 2 and the 4mm grass, so I added another layer of glue to make sure that the 4mm grass really would stick to the ground. And of course, after that was done, I also again went back in using my small vacuum cleaner. At this point I was a bit unsure about the amount of grass I added to the forest side of this scene. Normally there isn't much grass in the forest area. But after taking another look at reference pictures, I was convinced that it's quite okay and I didn't remove any of it. And of course, after I was done with the static grass, I also added a few grass tufts to the scene. Normally I use super glue to stick them down. They already have an adhesive on their back that works quite okay, but I like to use a bit of extra glue to make sure they stay in place forever. But this time I also went for my Crowdtech fast drying basing glue. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure why I did this. And I will use super glue the next time. The glue came out a bit too thick under those grass tufts, and I had to remove it using a wet brush in a few areas. But it will dry completely clear, so even if you miss a spot, it's almost invisible. And after I was done with the grass tufts, it was time for another fun task, adding small scatter material all over the base, like small stones and twigs and whatnot. I really like this task since it gives you a lot of creative freedom to shape the ground in the way you like. And after I added all those materials, I used VMS Sand Embellished Freeze to make sure they will stick in place forever. And after that was done, it was again time for Mr. Hobby Mr. Surfacer Mahogany. I sprayed a couple of thin layers all over the surface until everything was nice and dark, so I had an even base coat for my paint job. I usually like to start by painting the grass. This creates a lot of overspray, and some bright green overspray on the groundwork looks rather stupid, but some earth-colored overspray on the grass in the later steps isn't that big of a problem. This time I used my NATO green paint as a base coat for the grass, since I also used it on the tank and I like to make sure that the colors on the actual model and on the scene or on the diorama are a bit cohesive. And after everything received the base coat of NATO green paint, I started to add Deck 10 and Tamiya yellow green into my mixture to create some lighter and brighter spots all over the grass patches. This time I applied the lighter colors quite heavily all over the grass to create a nice and vibrant color scheme for this scene. And I also sprayed a bit of German yellow in a few selected areas to create the look of dried out grass in those patches. The next step wasn't really necessary. I used some Tamiya Deck 10 to outline the track marks all over the base, so I have a easier time spotting them when I'm painting the groundwork. They are now quite light, but in the end I will paint those a lot darker. And that Tamiya Deck 10 paint was followed by Tamiya Flat Earth, one of my go-to colors for the groundwork. I like to add it in an almost cloudy pattern, like you would do on a tank if you do a color modulation, all over the ground area, and then I can start working with enamel paints over that. If you like, it's also possible to add a few lighter colors to the flat earth to already add a more diverse finish with the airbrush, but in this case that wasn't really necessary since I decided to work quite a lot with my AK Interactive enamel effects. It's really easy to wet blend those AK enamel paints. I apply a few drops of paint to one area, a couple of drops of another paint to the area next to it, and then I use my mineral spirit to blend everything together until I get a nice ground texture. And again, I had a couple of reference pictures of different dirt rows, and I tried to recreate the look I've seen on those pictures on my diorama scene. Another big advantage of enamel paints is that they are quite easy to reactivate, so if you have to take a break while you're working, or you come back later and are not satisfied with the result you got so far, it's quite easy to reactivate them using the right thinner and to push them around a little more. And while you watch me working on the ground a little more, I'd like to take a moment to thank you all for the amazing support I received from you guys. I've said this before, but I'm truly blown away by all the positive feedback I get for my work, and I can't wait to show you all the exciting projects I have planned for this year. I would also like to give a special thank you to Derek and Ralph for joining my Patreon and financially supporting my work. You guys really helped me acquire all the tools and materials I need for these projects, and I'm incredibly grateful for your support. You are awesome. And to those of you who haven't checked out my Patreon page yet, feel free to take a look. There's a bunch of great stuff waiting for you. Regular work in progress updates, high quality pictures, and all the 3D models I designed myself. Once again, thank you all so much, especially my amazing Patreons. And if you're not subscribed to my channel, you might want to do that now. That would really help me out. Once again, thank you all so much. Let's now talk a bit about the idea behind this scene. In military modeling, our subjects are often quite dark and desaturated, and I had the urge to add a bit of color to my display cabinet. A couple of weeks ago, before I started this project, I've seen a video here on YouTube uploaded by a German tank commander, where he and his crew drive around in their Leopard tank in front of a nice and brightly colored autumn forest. And I really liked the scene, so I decided to recreate that. I screenshotted the video and used that as my main reference for this project. And I already told you that when I painted the Leopard tank itself, I tried to keep it a bit more desaturated, so I can really turn up the saturation on the scenic base, especially on the trees. And I treated this project more like an art study. I wanted to try out to create a nice and stark contrast in color and saturation between the model and the base. And I have to say I'm quite happy with the result, and it was a lot of fun to bring in some nice and bright colors into our military model making. And speaking of bright colored things, I added more leaves to the groundwork that have already fallen off from the trees, and I fixed them in place using my AK Interactive Gravel and Sand Fixer. And of course, after the Gravel and Sand Fixer was dry, I used the same oil paints I already used on my tree to paint the leaves on the ground. This again was a lot of fun to see all those leaves really pop from the groundwork and see all those bright colors that you would see in an autumn scene outside as well. And while doing this voiceover, I can see my display cabinet in the back, and it's quite easy to spot the scene from a few meters away between all those dark colored models with their green and grayish tones. Even in this small scale, it's quite visible in there. And before you ask, yes, it took quite a bit of time to paint all those leaves, but it wasn't too bad. Since oil paint takes quite a lot of time to dry, I was able to leave it out in the open. I just put a dust cover over it so it didn't get dirty, and when I had a couple of minutes, I painted a few leaves. When the paint got a bit too thick, I added a bit more thinner, and then it was workable again. So it wasn't too bad. Would be kind of annoying to do this all in one sitting, but separated over time, it's actually quite fun. And then it was time to stain the wooden veneer. I used ebony colored wood stain for that. For some reason it had a really hard time soaking to the surface, and the end result is a bit lighter than I imagined it. So if one of you guys is really knowledgeable about wood and wood stain, if you have an idea why this wood stain didn't soak into the surface, please let me know in the comments down below, so I can avoid this mistake on my next project. And then it was finally time to add the trees back into their place. And I used a drop of super glue to fix them, so they won't fall out ever again. This again was quite fun. It was so nice to see how all those bright colors started to pop, and how the scene almost started to lighten up, if you want to say it like that. I had a lot of fun doing this, and at this point I was quite confident that my end result will look a lot like the one I imagined before I started this project. Before I start a diorama like this, I always have quite a clear picture in my mind how I want the scene to look at the end. And I think most dioramas also have kind of an ugly phase where you are not sure if you will achieve your end result, and everything looks a bit off. So it's quite fun to see when you get closer to the end, everything coming together, and when the scene then resembles the look you imagined in your head. And as you all know by now, I like to paint small details, so I brought out a bunch of grey and off-white and beige paints and started to paint all those small pebbles and stone all over the road. And when I painted the groundwork before, I also made sure to add a bit of darker enamel paint around those stones, so they would pop even more now that they are highlighted. And after that was done, it was finally time to glue the tank into place and see how everything looks together. But of course we're not done yet. At this point the tank still looks like it's teleported into the scene, so I used a bit of the crowd cover Scenics Common Earth and a few leaves to blend it together with the base it's standing on. I applied small amounts of that stuff, and then I used again gravel and sand fixer to fix it into place. Gravel and sand fixer dries totally clear, and it won't be visible in the end when it's dry on the already painted surfaces of the tank. And of course I used the same earth colored enamel paints that I used for the groundwork to paint the earth that is now lying on the tracks and on the road wheels, so everything looks cohesive. And after I was finished with the road wheels and tracks, I placed a few more leaves on the upper surfaces of the tank. And yes, I also painted those using the same oil paints I used before for the leaves on the ground and the leaves that are still on the trees. These small steps really tied everything together and integrated the tank into the diorama. The tank now looks like it has hit a few trees, and because of that is now covered in those leaves. And with that, the work on the diorama was mostly done. But fear not, this video isn't over yet. There's one thing you all called for after the FW190 diorama video, a video about painting figures. And to be honest, this isn't the figure painting video, that's still in the works and will come after the next bigger project. But I have a lot of footage of the figures I painted for this project, and I'd like to show it to you. Painting figures in 1/72 scale is a whole different topic than painting 1/35 scale figures, so there will be a different video about that. But I really enjoyed painting those tiny figures and recreating the flag tarn pattern on their uniforms. These figures you will see in a moment are 3D printed by myself, and I bought the files from Germania Figures. They aren't completely period accurate for this tank, but honestly at this scale it's not really noticeable, and again it's something I didn't really care for, since this project was a lot more about the overall impressions than on specific historic details. After those figures were printed and cleaned up, and they printed really nice I have to say, I base coated them using Mr. Hobby Surfacer 1500 in black as a primer. And after the primer was dry, I added something I normally don't do when painting figures, adding a zenithal highlight. Normally I'd like to build my paint up from a dark background and work out all the colors, volumes and highlights on their own. But for those small figures I thought this wouldn't be the best idea, so I decided for a black primer, a white zenithal highlight, and then I used my airbrush to glaze over very thin layers of the base paint, so I get nice highlights and shadows right away. For this technique I mixed the AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylic paint with a lot of thinner and glaze medium, and I sprayed I think about 7 or 8 very thin layers over both figures until I got some nice bright highlights and some darker shadow areas. And I have to say I spared myself quite a lot of work with this technique. Working out all the highlights and shadowed areas on a figure this small still takes a bit of time, and it's not that visible after the camo pattern is added, so I was quite happy with this approach. Then it was time to add the camouflage pattern. I used an AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylic paint set for that, intended for modern camouflage, and those colors were a great fit. I diluted them a bit, not really to glaze consistency, a bit thicker, but I still was able to use the base coat with its highlights and shadows almost as a pre-shade for the camo pattern. I started by applying the brightest and lightest green paint over the medium green base coat. I then added the brown spots, followed by the dark green ones and the black ones. This way I was able to fix any mistakes I made with a darker paint and work over the paints I applied before. And again I used a bunch of reference pictures to recreate the camo pattern on German uniforms as close as possible. But I also tried to use my paints for shadows and highlights again. I applied a few more darker spots in the shadowed areas, and the highlight areas received more lighter spots. Overall, I'm quite happy with the result. This is my first time painting a German camouflage pattern, and it doesn't look too bad. But I'm also quite sure that it's a lot easier to do this in a small scale like this than on a bigger 1/35 scale figure. And I guess I have to find this out in the future. Also, painting those tiny figures was quite fast. I spent around 2 to 2.5 hours per figure, and that's way less time than I would have spent on a 1/35 scale figure. At this point, if you compare the camo pattern I painted here and an actual German uniform, you might think that it's way too bright, and you're correct with that. So after I finished the camouflage pattern, I did something I also normally don't do. I added a wash over the whole figure, or the whole uniform in this case. And for the wash I of course used again my AK Interactive enamel paints. In this case I used winter streaking grime. It's a bit greenish and it's quite dark, and I added it all over the uniform. After it dried for a couple of minutes, I took a clean brush dipped in enamel thinner and wiped off most of it. The winter streaking grime had two jobs in this case. First of all, it stuck to the shadowed areas and created fake shadows, so I don't have to paint those in on my own. It also acted as kind of a filter over the whole uniform and brought it a lot closer to the actual German uniforms I observed on reference pictures. Again, for 1/35 scale figures, I really don't like this approach, since in my opinion it's not controlled enough for a figure that big, but in this small scale it worked quite great. And then it was time for another thing I normally don't do, using Citadel paints, in this game for the flesh tones. Normally I prefer my AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylics, but I also normally build up the skin tones from a few different colors and mix my own skin tones. In this case, the pre-made option was a bit easier, And I also used the corresponding Citadel flash wash to add in the shadows. I then only had to paint in a few highlights on the nose and on the cheekbones, and then my work was done on the skin tones. Again, since those figures are quite small, it's not that important to add too many details, since it won't be visible in the end at all. His headgear then was painted with Scale 75 Artist's Black. I really like this paint to create a dark and black base coat on an area that has previously been painted in another color. And here again it was an easy option. I then used a bunch of lighter gray paints to add in a few highlights and volumes on the different panels on his helmet and on his microphone. Unfortunately, there isn't any better footage of me painting those areas, since those figures were so small that my camera had quite a hard time to bring them into focus, especially after the camo pattern was added. So again, there will be another figure painting video in the future with 1/35 scale figures. I already started working on that project, and it will be out after I finish my next big project I will tell you a little more about in the end. I also made the effort to paint those tiny German flags that normally sit on the arms of German uniforms. Unfortunately, they don't really show on video since they are so small, but they are clearly visible in reality or on the high quality pictures I uploaded to Patreon and added to the end of this video. I also tried a few different approaches for the helmet visors. Normally I like to paint kind of a lens effect, but unfortunately those areas were so small that it didn't really work out and it looked a bit weird on those helmets and those uniforms. So I opted for AK Interactive Wet Effects fluid. I base coated the visor in black and then dipped a few drops of Wet Effects fluid over to create a shiny look, and now they look like sunglasses, and I've seen a bunch of pictures of the real ones and I think it's quite fitting. Also, I wasn't really keen to paint a clear version of those goggles with those tiny 1/72 scale eyes. I keep that for the larger scales. And after I was finished with painting those tiny guys, I used super glue to glue them to the tank permanently. I started out by the loader and then added the tank commander. It was kind of a lucky coincidence that the tank commander has one arm and hand that perfectly fits to the ring that is attached to the turret of the Leopard 2A7B, and I really like this look, and I'm quite happy with the end result. And speaking of the end result, here it finally is. Again, I really enjoyed this project as a small palette cleanser after the last big project. But the next one will be a lot bigger. It will be again a tank, and there's a fixed deadline for this one, since I will be attending the Euro Model Expo at the end of March 2025 in Lingen, Germany. I tried to finish this tank in Diorama in time for this expo. At this point in time, I'm quite sure that I will make it, but we'll see what the future will bring. At this point, all I have to say is thank you again for all the amazing support. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please subscribe to my channel. If you haven't liked this video yet, please like this video, and if you haven't written a comment, please write a comment down below what you like most about this diorama. Also, if you haven't checked out the video how I built the Leopard, go ahead and watch this now. I'm quite sure if you enjoyed this one, you will enjoy that video as well. And once again, thank you so much to my amazing Patreons. You guys keep this channel running. If you haven't checked out my Patreon page yet, go ahead and check it out. Until the next one, take care.